Well, so thank you very much for the invitation today and to share a bit of the results and insights from my thesis. So the presentation that I prepared for today takes some of the chapters of my thesis and tries to weave a bit a story out of it, the story of what I call drought-tolerant indigenous crops, so crops that are resistant to drought and that are traditional from the area where I worked. My PhD, I defended it last March in Ictahuabe and was directed by Victoria Reyes Garcia, by Vanessa Lavery, that is from CIRAD, and by Ndiaye Fatou Faye, that is from ISRABAM. And to enter into the... Do you see me well? Yes, no? Yes, through the camera? Okay. So this picture shows a bit the first glimpse that I got when I arrived to the Bassari territory for the first time. That was 2019. My PhD was part of a broader project that was called Lychee project that aimed to understand or to explore how local people and indigenous, so how indigenous people and local communities understand and perceive climate change. And in particular, I wanted to focus on how does climate change affect crop diversity, from the lens of local knowledge. But very quickly, and this is the thing, I came to understand that this narrow focus that I had on the effect of climate change on crop diversity didn't make sense locally, because there were many other things happening and transforming lives and agriculture that were farther away from climate change. And this is what I try to show in this picture, because you see two agricultural common working days, one with rice and one with, both with rice, one with men and one with women. And this for me was a surprise at the beginning, because when I arrived for the first time to the Bassari territory, I came with the ideas that I had read in the ethnographies that were wrote about this area, in the first one in the 60s and another in the 80s, the two ethnographies. So I came with the idea that there would be, the main staple crops would be these drought-tolerant traditional crops that are called bambara nut, sorghum and fonio. So I was expecting these crops to be the ones that occupy most of people's work, and what I saw in reality was all the opposite. So people were mostly investing time in crops like rice, that actually is much more water demanding than sorghum, fonio or bambara, and this made me question, but if we are in a climate change scenario in theory where precipitation is going down, what's happening here? So the research question that guided this research was to understand, within a context of small-scale farming, why and how crop diversity is changing and what are these changes implying for climate resilience. And to reply to this question, because it's not a straightforward question that you can easily reply to it, I imagine, or I use this metaphor of a bride or of a trenza, that so I take different perspectives and then I try to weave them through the thesis so that the insights from one perspective enter into dialogue or inform the other, and to be able to provide a bit an answer to this difficult question. For today, I will focus on two of the three threads that I developed with my thesis, because I thought it's better to enter into detail and not to give a superficial overview of everything. So just to introduce you a bit into the case study, I worked in three villages that you see marked on the map, that are in the southeastern part of Senegal, in one region that is called Kédougou. And one very characteristic thing of the biophysical environment and of the climate of the area is that there is a very marked dry season and a very marked rainy season that completely transform the landscape, but not only the landscape, but also the life of the people. So you see a completely different village life in the rainy season than in the dry season. And in the rainy season is where most of agricultural work takes place. Actually, agriculture is the main economic activity. Subsistence, rain-fed agriculture is the main economic activity in the area. And I chose these pictures concretely, the picture that you see a group of people that seems a party or a festivity. This was not a party, this was the cotton harvest. And I chose it because in most of these common agricultural working days, at the end, there are always rites or masks, sacrifices, so it really embedded this fact of working together in agriculture is really embedded in the traditional culture and in the customs. Then, like in most societies, gender relations shape access and use of resources, with women having most of the weight of domestic tasks. And the picture of the road is because is to symbolize change. I think this road was being constructed while I was doing my fieldwork there during the 16 months that I was there, and I think it completely changes also the connection between the Bassari territory and the rest of Senegal. In this case, this road connects this Bassari territory with Kédougou. So you will see through my presentation that there are many changes that are affecting the Bassari society that are really transforming it. And now to enter a bit into detail with agriculture in the area, this is the agricultural calendar. In the outside part you have the seasons as the Bassari identify them. So you have Gechacha, Gajilis, Gekol and Gaye. And then you have the start of the rainy season and the dry season. And if you continue inside of the circle, you have the calendar of the crops. So when crops are harvested, are seeded, grown and then harvested. And as you can see, what I was commenting before, that most of the cycle of the crops, to not say all, happens within the rainy season. And also the Bassari seasonal calendar, so the way that they name the seasons, it's also closely connected to agriculture and to the rain. For example, Gechacha means it's time to seed, or Gajilis means the seeds are already there. Gekol means it's time to harvest, and Gaye means it's time to rest. So just to see this strong connection between the Bassari and agriculture. And then on the right, this is a bit to symbolize the effect of climate change, because this calendar is a bit a picture of how the situation is now with the calendar, but actually this is changing. Every time rains less in the area and the rainy season is longer. So this is something that is shortening the time that people have to cultivate in a region where everything is rain-fed, so there is no irrigation. And to continue with the agricultural system of the Bassari, this map shows the main field types identified by them in the local language. Oshenga, that are the fields in the mountains. Eden are the fields in the plains or the valleys, and Enam are the fields that you cultivate around your house. And these, like local taxonomy, I don't know how to say this naming of the types of field, it not only refers to the location, but it has implications in the way that crops are, the type of crops that are cultivated there. For example, in Oshenga, people cultivate all the traditional crops like sorghum, fonio and bambara. In Eden is where people cultivate introduced crops like rice or like maize. But it also affects the management practices. For example, in Oshenga there is crop rotation, whereas in Eden no, it's much more intensive, the form of producing. It also affects the way the land is inherited. In Oshenga, land goes through from fathers to sons. In Eden, it goes through the mother line, from the uncles, from the maternal uncle. So it's really very different how these different fields are managed and the role they play in the local farming system. And today, now that I presented a bit this overview of farming, I wanted to focus on the story of these three crops, of sorghum, that is mostly a main crop, bambara, that is a women crop. It's like both constitute enap, that is the main staple food that the Bassari consume, and fonio. These three crops have been all domesticated in sub-Saharan Africa, and they are endemic from the area. They are cultivated by the Bassari since a very long time, and are these crops that I was expecting to find almost exclusively when I arrived for the first time there. But it's impossible to understand the story of these crops without understanding also the story of the new crops that arrived later on into the farming system, which are maize, rice and peanut. Peanut is a crop that arrived with the colonial rule, the French colonial rule. So end of 1800s and beginning of the 1900s, and rice and maize arrived more recently through development projects. So now I will start with the first thread, that what tries is to take a retrospective look, so a historical look at the farming system to understand what are the drivers and what are the causes of these changes in the crop portfolio, and what are also the consequences. And for this I operationalized it, we can say, through different objectives. The first one was to identify the contemporary trends in the cultivation of staple crops. And to identify these trends, I was using national statistics, but they are not so they are at the Kedugu level, so it's a big region with very heterogeneous types of villages. And then I was also doing a household survey in the village where I was working. On a second step, I was characterizing the main historical steps of agricultural development to understand how this might have influenced also local trends, and this was done through archival research and key informant interviews. And on a last step, I explored the local explanations that farmers give for these changes, and also the consequences that they are experiencing. So first, this is from the data that I collected at village level myself. And what we see very clear is what already I saw in 1 week there, that it's that yes, that maize, rice and peanut are increasing in cultivation, and the other more traditional are in recession, are being abandoned. And a very similar trend, I found it with the statistics at national level. Then, when trying to make this exercise of seeing what might have been the role of public policy and of the different stages of agricultural development, I started situating all the main events that happen at regional, national and local scale to then try to weave these things together. And I was looking at public policies, specifically focusing on the crops that were promoted, and based on the crops that were promoted, I identified like 3 main periods. The first one, that it's the one that goes from the 1900 until the 1960, that is the peanut boom that coincides with the French colonial, the peanut boom that coincides with the French colonial rule. So at the regional national scale, what was happening in this moment is that the colonial rule was promoting peanut cultivation to be exported for oil for industrializing France. In this case, and then this cash crop arrived to local communities like the Bassari as the first cash crop, because it was the only opportunity for them in this case to be able to earn money to pay the poll taxes that were imposed by the colony. So in this moment, Bassari, as we see in the picture, sorghum and bambara were the main crops, but peanut arrived and was cultivated as a cash crop. The second big period started with the independence of Senegal and in the 1960s, and it was there was this big oil crisis in the global north that coincided with a very strong drought period in the Sahel that also affected Senegal, and all this caused the collapse of the peanut sector. And finally, that the Senegalese state disengages from agricultural policy, and in this sense, there was a lot of investment again in cash crops by private companies. In this case, cotton arrived also to the local communities as another alternative source of cash to peanut, and also maize arrived. And finally, let's say the more contemporary period that started in the 2000s, it started with a very strong famine that brought a bit this topic about agricultural policy again into the plate of the state, that re-engaged into agricultural policy and started promoting the cultivation of cereals for food security. But the main cereals that were promoted again were not like these traditional cereals, but rather maize, rice, etc. So with all this, at the end, the main message that I wanted to transmit is that all these colonial and post-colonial agricultural policies were favoring the expansion of exotic crops with market value or with high yield, but did not value all these indigenous crops that were there. But still, this probably is not reason enough for Bassari to stop cultivating the crops that they always cultivated. So then, asking the farmers why, what are you growing, and if they abandon one of these, why did you abandon the cultivation of one of these crops, came up with this conceptual map. Here it's only, I only put the reasons that were more consensual or where there was more people that were mentioning them. Of course, there were many more. And to focus for this presentation, I would like to focus on one, that is the decrease in labor availability. That was a very important reason for people in the Bassari territory to stop cultivating sorghum, bambara and fonio, because these are crops that actually require much more workforce, both for the cultivation but also post-harvest and for transformation and cooking. One of the reasons related to this decrease in labor availability was increase of out-migration. And here I wanted to refer to one of the quotes of one woman farmer with whom I was talking, that she said, my mother and my grandmother cultivated it, but the harvest is hard. You need to spend all day bended down in the field to only harvest a very small bit. My daughters have never cultivated it. Youth prefers big towns, no? And this shows a bit these trends that are happening also there, that most of the youth migrates either seasonally or the whole or permanently to look for other ways of earning a living. Another very common topic that came out in these interviews was the decrease in this communal agricultural labor that I presented at the beginning as a very characteristic trait of the Bassari society. And again, as one woman also explained me, she said, before the children from all the neighborhoods would organize themselves to harvest all the fonio fields of the village. Non-initiated boys would do it without expecting anything in return. Nowadays, everyone is for himself and God for all of us. So it's a way also to show how all these rules that were marking like the life in the Bassari society, in this case the age class system, was also very connected to agricultural work and to these common working days. In the moment when all these structures lose importance, this also affects farming. And the other reason given was obligatory primary schooling, that this was imposed during the colonial rule, but it didn't really become effective until quite recently. Because actually children are very important for doing agricultural tasks there. And as one farmer explained me, I used to cultivate a big field of sorghum, but as neighbors abandoned sorghum cultivation and children started going to school, all the birds were feasting on my field. I was discouraged. I was cultivating for the birds because nobody is there scaring the birds from the field, so there are a lot of losses. And the final reason, also linking to this decrease in labor availability, is the increase in cotton cultivation. So the fact that there is land and labor devoted to these introduced crops also, of course, affects the land and labor available for traditional crops, and concretely cotton. And here I choose two citations because I think that they reflect a bit like the two sides of this coin. On the one hand, cotton as a source of cash, like shows the first one that says, cotton is the only option to earn money to pay children's schooling. You can have 100 cows, but to whom are you going to sell them to? No, there's nobody that will buy them. So this shows the need for a cash crop to cover the increasing cash needs that are needed in this society, that it's also increasingly integrated into a market economy. But on the other hand, what this implies for women and for the domestic sphere, no? And this is what I wanted to show with this citation from a women farmer that said, sorghum is a problem because you need to have a husband who is willing to remove the trees and clear the area. So I cannot manage. And then I asked her, but you are married or you have a husband? I don't know what more or less. And she said, I have a husband, but he pays too much attention to cotton, so that's why we fail to grow sorghum due to cotton. So because men are fully dedicated into cotton, they don't help the cultivation of sorghum that traditionally has been a men thing, and it's very important for subsistence, as I explained, this traditional dish that it's enough made of cotton and bambara. So at the end, all this falls into women's shoulders. Either they jump into traditional crops like cotton or somebody, admit it. So with this, I wanted to show how these policy level discourses or narratives and also practices are interacting with local trends and gender dynamics to shift agricultural practices and at the end the crop diversity that farmers grow. And then I asked myself, okay, but what are the consequences of this shift from crops? No? That we are observing that certain crops are being abandoned and others adopted. One of the first consequences is the shift of cultivation area from the mountains to the plains, because maize and rice are crops that are cultivated in the plains, whereas all the traditional crops are cultivated in the mountains. What this implies, first, increasing land scarcity, because the area in the plains is very limited compared to the area in the mountains that there is a lot. So while everybody, every household and every farmer can have access to Oshenga, to land in the mountains, not all households can have access to land in the plains. So this, of course, creates new inequalities in the village of who has access to this land in the plains to cultivate these new crops and who cannot have it. And then also there are some land tenure changes, because in the Bassari territory there is no official titling for the land, but people have use rights. And what's happening in Eden is that people is starting to sell these use rights one to another to be able to cultivate in the plains, and this is something that had not happened before. Another consequences of the adoption of new crops is like the change in farming practices, in this case the abandonment of crop rotation, again because land in the plains is less available, people intensify the way of production in the plains, so there is no crop rotation, you don't leave the earth rest, this causes soil fertility and land degradation, and it goes together with the use of chemical fertilizers and pesticides, with the possible market dependency that this can entail. Another of the consequences is the exacerbation of the local structural inequalities. This is what I wanted to show a bit with cotton. That is the question of who is benefiting and who is losing from it. Not all the community and all the members of the household are benefiting the same from this introduction of the cotton. In this case, because women do not control the income that comes from cotton, and many times this money is not directly invested into household subsistence, actually they feel the burden of this, because they have to cultivate more and they lose control on income. At the same time, some poor households, they have uncovered food needs, because if you cultivate less subsistence crops. And finally, there is also the increase in water requirements, like I was saying, because these are crops that require more water in a climate and in an area that it's actually drying. So this was a bit this overview and retrospective perspective, and now I wanted to enter into what are the contemporary dynamics, and concretely this I look at it understanding how does seed circulate, how do farmers have access to seed, and how then this access to seed affects the distribution of crop diversity in farmers' fields. So here again, I operationalized this with different objectives, in this case two. The first one, that was to characterize the local networks of seed circulation that I did through seed network surveys. And in these seed network surveys, I was asking farmers for their source of seeds. And concretely, in every household, I talked to the man and to the woman household head. And if it was polygamous, like some households are, then to all the women. So to this generation, I didn't talk to the elders or to the offspring, but to this household head generation. Then I explored the relation between the position that farmers occupy in the seed circulation network of the community and the diversity of crops and also varieties that they cultivate in their fields. And this is a conceptual map that shows the way that I understand how different households can be differently positioned to access seed from one source or from another. In this case, we find that some households, well, every node are households, and then the direction of the arrow shows the direction of the seed flow. And here we see that some households might be very well positioned to access seed from markets or from NGOs, whereas other households might be better positioned to access seed from other households or from households from outside the village. So, and this is what we look like, this is how the seed networks look like when you construct them and visualize them with the real data that I collected on the field. You have the three traditional crops on top and the introduced crops down. And then depending the node size, say it means it's the out degree, so it means the number of people that use this node as a source of seed, so how important a node is as a source of seed. And the colors also represent the type, so whether it's a household, a project, or a market vendor. So for these graphs, because I was interviewing several people within a household, all this was pulled together, all these seed acquisitions were pulled together at the household level and then represented like this. So, and here what we can see is that for introduced crops, actors like projects and NGOs and market vendors play a very important role and quite centralizing with high out degree compared to the more traditional crops that only circulate farmer to farmer. Another thing that we can see quite quick is that the networks of the traditional crops are smaller and are in general more fragmented compared to the other networks. And now to enter into detail with a couple of examples, the first example I would like to show you is peanut, because peanut was the biggest network, more dense, also more reciprocal, better connected, and the one that had a broader geographical extension so that people went further away to get seeds. And this has to do with this history or socioeconomic history of peanut in the study area, as I explained that peanut was a crop introduced during this colonial time as a cash crop. Nowadays, peanut is not anymore a cash crop, it's a subsistence crop. People sell only the few extra parts that they have of peanut, but still peanut circulates a lot through markets, and women use peanut as an alternative currency. So you can go to buy soap or sugar, and instead of pay with money, you can pay with peanut. So this is there still, I think, from this history, and this makes that peanut circulates much more than other crops. And a bit as a very contrasting example, we have the network of sorghum that here we painted with different colors depending on the neighborhood of the households. And what you see is that actually the circulation of seed, so there are communities that correspond quite well with the neighborhoods to which these households belong to. And this has an explanation also in the way sorghum circulates, because sorghum circulates a lot from fathers to sons, and because residence is patrilocal. So at the end, how this descent, finally an alliance allows to structure also the distribution of seed of sorghum. And now I wanted to show you again the same networks but looking at different things. So now the networks are at individual level, so not grouping per households but letting all the individuals, and here the colors represent the gender, whether it's a man or a woman. And here what we see is that crops like bambara nut, for example, circulate almost exclusively through women. In the Bassari tradition there is an interdiction, for example, that men cultivate bambara. The same like there is an interdiction that women cultivate sorghum, but this is not what we see with the sorghum network, because with sorghum we see that actually women play an important role in the sorghum network. And this is not here, but we also carried some extra analysis to see whether gender could determine the position of the households of the farmers in the network. And we saw that actually, in general, women taking part in the sorghum network had higher betweenness than men, so that they were acting as pasadoras of diversity, brokers of diversity. Then we see that in the new crops, rice and peanut, predominantly women that are the ones that are for subsistence, and in maize we see that there are more men. So we see also that how the circulation of the seeds is very gendered. So to a bit conclude this part, what we find here is that seed circulation is shaped by the biocultural status of the crops. I call biocultural status all this, what I try to explain, so the role that a crop has in the local farming system based on the socioeconomic history, but also on the fact of, well, more resistant or less resistant to drought and all this. So the networks depend on the biocultural status. Traditional and introduced crops do not circulate in the same way. we also find that in the networks of introduced crops, external actors like markets, NGOs play a very centralizing role in the network, and this we don't find it in traditional crops. And then we find that farmers use both like these more centralized networks through external actors, but also the farmer-to-farmer networks to access seed and to access new seed of the varieties. And in another step, what we try to understand is, okay, now we understand how seed circulates, but how does this affect actually the crop diversity that people cultivate in their fields? And here we run generalized linear models to try to explain varietal diversity at household level. We also did it at individual level, but now here I present at household to explain it with the centrality of the household and other control variables. And here what we found is that for all crops, we found that more central nodes in general, so households that were more central in the network cultivated more diversity. In these graphs you find the number of varieties. Diversity in this case meant number of varieties for each of these crops. So the network of sorghum means that central households in the sorghum network cultivate more varieties of sorghum. This was the... And we find a relationship for all crops, but differently. So, well, for some crops, the relationship was in degree, for others was without degree, with betweenness, and all this was really crop-specific and also variety-specific. So, but at the end we see that yes, that the way that the seed circulates and how a farmer is positioned in this network affects finally the diversity that the farmer cultivates on farm. Of course, there can also be, it's what is first, the egg or the chicken, no? Can also be that because a farmer cultivates a lot of diversity also holds a more central position in the network, but in any case that these two aspects are related, we see. And now to briefly explain the conclusion, in this case, waiving only these two threads, and coming back to the question that I asked at the beginning of the presentation, that was to understand within a context of small-scale farming why and how crop diversity changes and what such changes imply for climate resilience. What we are seeing is that first, that crop diversity trends are explained by the interaction between all these broader socioeconomic changes, but also changes that are happening more at the local scale and all the household dynamics. And then from the second thread, one key message to retain is also that now there is a coexistence of these new and old ways of sourcing seed and of circulating seed, and that this affects on-farm crop diversity. Then, in terms of policy implications of this, for the first one is that focusing agricultural adaptation policies only with a narrow focus on climate change doesn't make sense, said in very simple words, because actually agriculture and farmers' crop portfolios are affected by a very wide diversity of causes, so you have to take all this context into account if you really want to foster adaptation. Then more concrete for the seed system, until now all the seed systems interventions that we have seen in the local farming system are completely top-down, so are crops and varieties that come mostly from the research and that are brought to the farmers in a top-down and very centralizing approach. So in this sense I call for more participatory and decentralizing approaches if we are to support the local seed system. And what are the implications for climate resilience? That this is a very difficult question to answer and also with a small trap. If we look at how the farming system was for what we know and how it is nowadays, you could say that now is more resilient because it's diversifying in terms of crops, but also diversifying in ways of governance, in how seed is shared. We find this coexistence because between these two different ways of seed access and circulation. But then with what I also try to argument with my thesis is that resilience, if we talk about it, we cannot understand it as a picture in a concrete moment, but rather as a process. And if we look back and I try to understand resilience as a process, as a process that is relational, contextual, social and politically embedded. And then if we do this exercise with the Bassari, we see that actually there has been a very strong process of dispossession of the own agroecologists of the Bassari, of their knowledge about the diversity of crops, of undervaluation of the diversity of indigenous crops that they were cultivating, that started in colonial times by this top-down imposition of peanut, but continued nowadays with agricultural development projects bringing new seeds and crops into the farming system without looking at the diversity and the richness that is already there. So in this sense, I think that all these developments are not contributing to build climate resilience or to help the process of climate resilience. And that's all. Thank you for your attention.